Good morning, everyone. My name is Frank Reedy, and I'm representing the Strategic Studies Department here at JSOU. Today, we're pleased to present a conversation with a distinguished guest, including audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or USSOCOM. Since unsettled weather or other technical interruptions have a chance of occurring, if you lose connection, just rejoin the session. If the internet fails you, you can always dial in. If you have feedback or questions after the session, email thinkjsou@socom.mil as indicated on the slide. Today's moderator is Mr. Kyle Garland, Senior Faculty at JSOU. He will introduce the program and today's guest.
My name is Kyle Garland, and I'm from the Joint Special Operations University, located in Tampa, Florida. I want to welcome everyone to another online interview of Think JSOU. Think JSOU is an ongoing program that explores research and publications of JSOU faculty, resident senior fellows, leading academics, and the wider SOF and international security community. The online collection includes interviews and conversations with authors and researchers and is intended to supplement existing publications, articles, and other active discussions. As usual, I encourage everyone to explore the complete Think JSOU collection by reviewing our online offerings posted to the All Partner Access Network, or APAN, and also available for streaming through our library and JSOU social media sites. For our online attendees this afternoon, if you have a question for our guest, please submit the question using the Q&A icon on your toolbar. Today, we are honored to have Mr. Daniel Wagner rejoin us to discuss his recent books titled The Chinese Vortex, The Belt and Road Initiative and Its Impact on the World, and The America-China Divide, The Race to Control the World. Mr. Wagner is joining us from Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I'm very hopeful that his hotel internet connection continues throughout the interview. Mr. Wagner is the founder and CEO of Country Risk Solutions and a widely published author on current affairs and risk management. He has extensive experience in Asian affairs and is the author of 8 books, over 700 articles, and is a regular contributor to a broad range of publications, including the South China Morning Post. Mr. Wagner, thanks very much for taking time out of your business trip to Africa. Thank you for joining us today.
It's a real pleasure to be back with you, Kyle. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're lucky to have you. Sir, the current United States National Defense Strategy emphasizes great power competition, and it has shifted the focus away from counterterrorism efforts. You have written 2 books recently that we're going to discuss today. Your first book, The Chinese Vortex, is an exploration of the impact of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative has had and is having on its member nations throughout the world. The Belt and Road Initiative is clearly a net positive in terms of developmental impacts and the ability to contribute to raising the standard of living for hundreds of millions of people around the world. However, as you point out in your book, it is the destructive or negative impacts of the initiative that merit close scrutiny. Your second book, The America-China Divide, addresses everything from the trade and tech wars to aid, diplomacy, and other parts of the relationship that gets less attention, but are nonetheless evolving in ways that headlines fail to capture. So, sir, I want to begin by discussing your first book, The Chinese Vortex. And I usually like to begin with a rather broad question that helps define the topic. So, sir, can you please explain what is the Belt and Road Initiative and what does the Chinese government want the world to believe it is? And, sir, if you don't mind, while you're talking, I'm going to try to share my screen and just show a couple of slides so we can see what it looks like graphically.
Sounds good. So the Belt and Road Initiative, or otherwise known as the BRI, which I will describe throughout our discussion today, really started in 2013. It started with a speech that President Xi gave in Kazakhstan, wherein he described a sort of idyllic program that the Chinese were going to unveil to the rest of the world. And this program talked about peaceful coexistence. It talked about non-interference in other countries' affairs. And it basically sounded as if it was going to be a development project, and it painted a picture as if China was nothing but altruistic. Now, China had an opportunity here to make it an altruistic endeavor. They could have given money to these countries or simply paid for it themselves in order to produce all this infrastructure that is encompassed in the BRI. But instead, what it did is it actually lent the money to these countries, usually through China Exim Bank or the China Development Bank. And sometimes it lent that at high interest rates. And as a result, although it's doing good by producing these infrastructure projects and generating jobs and tax revenue and all of that, it is leaving these countries saddled with an enormous amount of debt. So if you think about this on a map, and I think Kyle's going to put up the first slide. So the BRI is really cut into two parts, if you will. There's the land part that connects China with Europe, and it's really a recreation, if you will, of the old Silk Road. Then there's also the maritime portion, and that connects China with ports from around the world. And this is done deliberately. It's done so that China really has some element of control over both land and sea routes. You see in this second slide here that the sea route goes both into the Arctic, over Scandinavia into Europe, and then from China into Africa, through the Middle East into Europe, and from China then down into other parts of Oceania. And in doing so, it's really got the bulk of world trade covered here. Let's not forget, however, that ultimately Europe is the answer for the Silk Road that they're trying to recreate. All roads sort of end there. And the European project is absolutely critical here, because without Europe, where do all those goods go? From Europe, of course, it can be distributed to other parts in the world.
Well, thanks, sir, for the description. But now I'd like to ask you, what does the United States think of the Belt and Road Initiative, or what does a China analyst such as yourself think of the BRI?
So the US was not invited to be part of the BRI, nor would it have accepted if it was invited. This is primarily targeting developing countries, although there are some semi-developed countries, say in Eastern Europe, that are part of this initiative. But the US has largely been leery of this, the government, from the beginning. I think many China analysts in the US government and elsewhere in the world seem to think that this is part of a Chinese attempt to enhance its soft power and its hard power in some respects. And that being the case, it's an extension of its foreign policy. And it's very, very clear that this is part of an orchestrated project which is designed to be long-term oriented and have a profound impact on China's ability to influence the world. So seeing it from that basis, the US government is saying, well, maybe we need to think about doing something to counter this. It has started some initiatives in that regard. The Development Finance Corporation is a direct response to that, which is a combination of OPIC and some other ideas within the US government to counter the Chinese presence in some parts of the world. That's a $60 billion initiative. That's a good start. But when you think about the $1 trillion that ultimately China is going to spend on this initiative, the 60 billion sort of pales in comparison. There are some other initiatives the US is doing. However, if I had my way, we would be doing a heck of a lot more. As far as China analysts, well, they're basically divided into either pro or anti-Chinese camps. There's not too much in the middle. If you're pro-China, this is the best thing since sliced bread. If you're anti-China, well, you're going to be very concerned about some of the implications of the BRI.
I'm really glad that you talked about some of the efforts of what the US government or other governments can do to counter Chinese influence. So I'm actually going to ask you that question a little bit later on today. But in your opinion, sir, why did the Chinese government target so many poor countries and failing states?
Well, there's sort of two answers there. One is the obvious one, that they're the ones who need the infrastructure the most. But perhaps the less obvious one is that some of the poorest and neediest among the developing countries with the fewest resources are the least able to resist it. There's only so much development resources that are going to be able to be applied to the infrastructure question in developing countries. So that part of it is good. The countries need it. China is willing to provide it. That's just fine. The flip side of that, of course, is that China, despite the fact that it could cooperate with other governments and with multilateral agencies, has chosen not to do so in this initiative. It wants to spend its own money, its own way, and on its own terms. So there is no coincidence in this regard, and that is that some of the poorest and neediest countries also happen to perhaps be the most corrupt and the least likely to attach some governance to how this program is going to be implemented. In fact, a very significant portion of the BRI countries are among the lowest ranking in Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. In fact, many of the countries rank in the lowest 15th percentile. But that suits China very well because it can sort of do what it wants on its own terms. It's structured contracts in these countries that basically require them to use Chinese law, Chinese arbitration in order to resolve problems. And then, of course, that opens the door to de facto expropriation of these assets.
Can you repeat the cost of this initiative, please?
It is $1 trillion. It's probably going to be in excess of $1 trillion when it's over with. And there's already been some $700 billion which has been devoted. Now, it's worth pointing out that China in 2013 is a little bit different than China is today. Its economy is severely impacted by COVID. But the truth is that in 2013, at the birth of the BRI, this was more an expression not of China's omnipotence, but of some structural and inherent weaknesses that were occurring in the Chinese economy. They basically wanted to keep the plates spinning. They wanted to keep the state-owned enterprises up and running. And the BRI gave the government and these SOEs the ability to, for example, export coal technology and some other elements that are pretty fundamental to the Chinese economy to other places, and to keep critical industries up and running because many of them were failing at the time. So far from representing a supreme, healthy and successful economy, even in 2013, it represented a weak economy. And that's important to keep in mind in the background here.
Yeah, so $1 trillion, now I think that with the Chinese economy, that's probably not so insurmountable as it may have been 7 years ago. But how about the funding for these projects? And not only the funding, but what are these host countries, what are their requirements or responsibilities for any part of the funding? I think we probably know the answer to that. And then my second part to this is, in these poor countries, what is the income, or I'm sorry, the impact to the lower income, middle income population of those countries?
Sure. So in many cases, the host governments themselves are putting up some of the money. But what's ended up happening is that they're ultimately borrowing tens of billions of dollars. And when this is being lent, it's understood by all the participants that there's no way these countries could ever pay it back. So China's lending this money to these countries knowing it can't be paid back, and it's having them sign agreements which basically say, when inevitably you cannot pay it back, I'm going to expropriate these strategic assets, whether they're ports or roads or railroads or power plants in your country. Now, this is exactly the opposite of how it's supposed to work. The way it's supposed to work is a host country is supposed to expropriate a foreign investor's assets should they have a problem with the project. This is exactly the reverse. The Chinese are expropriating on a de facto basis, some of these critical assets in the host country with the government's blessing, because they signed a contract basically giving them the ability to do so. So in doing so, the Chinese government is ultimately then gaining control of these strategic assets. Now, it's not doing itself much of a favor in the process because it's ruining its own reputation by seizing these strategic assets, and it's having a huge backlash now in many countries. Now, related to your question of the impact on the common person there, so there's two schools of thought. One school of thought is that China's creating a tremendous amount of jobs that go to the locals. Another is that it's importing a lot of Chinese folks to do the work. There's a little bit of element of truth to both, but the truth is that most of the work that's being done to build these projects and operate them actually comes from among the host country population. That said, there are many Chinese firms that are coming in at the same time and competing with local firms. So if you ask the common person in the street in many of these countries, you're going to get a mixed bag. You're going to say, well, myself or a family member actually has a job as a result. On the other hand, they're having to compete with Chinese companies, and it's sort of a mixed bag.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's kind of what I was referring to when I said I think we know the answer to this question is that they don't expect to get paid back, or I guess they expect to get paid back in other ways.
Well, I think they'd all be pleasantly surprised if they were to be paid back. That's just not happening. In fact, many countries are re-entering highly indebted poor country status. Zambia, for example, is a country that graduated from HIPC status in the 1990s and has reassumed that status as a result of the tens of billions of debt that it's gone into. Kenya's another one. I mean, it had $50 billion worth of debt by 2018, and it just didn't have the resources to do much with it.
Yeah. Well, like I mentioned in the introduction, when we were talking about the BRI, it has had a positive impact, economic impact on these countries. And you just mentioned that, yes, there might be some jobs that are being provided. But what can you tell us about some of these other circumstances, political, environmental, social conditions that the Belt and Road Initiative is having on these lower income countries?
So as you might imagine, it's having a very significant impact on bilateral relations with these countries, usually in a positive way. And many of these countries are really not in a position to do much about that. It's sort of like, I like to say that China is bulldozing the landscape. It doesn't really have much subtlety in how it's doing things. And that's part of why there's a backlash here. You know, Xi wanted to introduce, he did introduce, if you will, BRI Light back in 2018, where they wanted to be friendlier toward the environment. Bear in mind that much of the technology that's being exported to BRI countries is actually dirty technology, like coal plants. You know, some 40 coal plants have been built throughout the world. They had the option to use renewable energy, and in a few cases they have, mostly in hydropower. But the impact on the environment in the countries where these coal plants have occurred is really devastating. For instance, in Pakistan, they didn't really have a problem with that, and now they have a tremendous problem because they put so many coal-fired power plants in place. There's another element to the environment as well, I touch on in the book, which happens to be the illegal exportation of exotic wildlife, particularly from Africa. That's something that not many people would consider, but it's interesting, when the BRI projects occur, that's when the illegal trade in wild animals tends to occur. So there's a definitive link there. I think the bigger issue for me is that there's just not much of an orientation towards green technology and renewable energy and that sort of thing in the BRI. She said that they wanted to do something about that in 2018, but they really haven't done much.
Sure, I have one more question for you regarding the Belt and Road Initiative, and it actually sort of corresponds with a comment that just popped up from our online audience. So I'll read them kind of both, but my question for you is, do you believe that the Chinese government is using the Belt and Road Initiative to expand its military footprint around the world? And then the comment from our online members said that China is using this to control port infrastructure, which would extend their naval footprint around the world. So, I mean, that member saw it even before I asked the question, but what's your opinion on, is it going to use this for a military expansion?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yes, it is the short answer. And there are many things to say about this. First, let me point out that, as I mentioned briefly, this is also about the expansion of its own hard power. And it's doing that, for example, by creating this port in Djibouti, which is located very near America's port in Djibouti, as sort of a direct competition, if you will. But I think what your listener may be alluding to is the purchase of a lot of ports in Europe, the purchase of some controlling interest and some minority interest in some of these ports in Europe, where a lot of American ships, American military ships, happen to dock. That's made things very sensitive in some of our closest allies for some basic things that we do with our military ships, even docking there. But beyond that, there's something called the string of pearls, which India alleges China is using to surround India in the Indian Ocean. I would cite, for example, the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, Gwadar in Pakistan, and some other ports. India is very sensitive about that. So China hasn't exactly been shy in using the BRI to expand that port infrastructure for its own needs. And I think ultimately what it's wanting to do is enhance its naval presence and capability through the ability to dock in all of these ports. Many of your listeners will be aware that China actually has the largest navy in the world. And soon, with the addition of several additional aircraft carriers, their ability to project power is going to be even more significant. So anyone from China who wants to tell you that this is all about development and not about the expansion of hard power, I really think that's not correct.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to take a couple of questions from our online members before we move off of the Belt and Road Initiative. And the first one is do you consider this a modern day mercantilism?
Sure, not only mercantilism, but neocolonialism. I mean, it seems very clear this sort of take and grab approach and get whatever you can, however you can, is certainly designed to be both mercantilist and neocolonialist. And I would simply suggest that it's evidence of the worldview that the Chinese government seems to have. My first book on China, and by the way, these two books that we're talking about today sort of end up the trilogy. There's 3 books. The first one, which you and I spoke about several months ago, Kyle, is called China Vision, which talks about China's alternative worldview. And the BRI is certainly an extension of that. And if China had its way, what the government would do is simply craft a world in which everything looks like China. And the BRI is certainly consistent with that. And I would urge any listeners who have particular interest in that to take a look at that book.
Yeah. Another question from our online audience. Now, when I put up the map of the Belt and Road Initiative, obviously through Africa, Western, Eastern Europe, and the maritime routes around. So this is not on that particular part of the world, but the question was about South America. And he said, especially Brazil. What are they doing with expansion there in South America?
So the Latin American countries, and I touch upon this in the book, many of them were hesitant, especially the largest economies there, Brazil and Argentina, for example. They were hesitant to jump into the BRI for several reasons. The most prominent among them is that they have great relations with the US, and they didn't want to throw a wrench in that relationship. But there are a number of economies in Latin America that dove headfirst in, Venezuela being among them. Many people may not realize, but China is Venezuela's largest lender, something in excess of $60 billion. And given that it's a failed state and it's a perilous state, China has a very strong relationship with Venezuela, and including its space program. There's a couple of countries in Latin America, Argentina being another, where they have set up space platforms to give them the ability to launch from these countries. But there are all sorts of other undercurrents going on there. Many people may not be aware that many Latin American countries have made themselves incredibly dependent on China by virtue of taking 80 or 90% of their exports and making themselves dependent on China, whether it's iron ore or soybeans, whatever it may be. So China certainly has a very significant presence in Latin America. It has a growing presence vis-a-vis the BRI. But let me just say this. Whether a country is actually a formal member of the BRI or not, that doesn't mean that China is not active there. Let me use the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, where I am today. It is not a member of the BRI, and yet 53% of its exports goes to China. I got to tell you, the elevator that I'm in, it's got Chinese signs in it. I see Chinese signage all over town here in Kinshasa. So they've certainly made their presence known. And again, a country that needs the resources, needs the money to develop their infrastructure, this is a good example of a country that's going to say yes.
Okay. Well, we have two more questions before we move off of the Belt and Road Initiative. And the first one reads, Sir, how does the official Chinese government investment interact with the investment of Chinese companies along the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yeah, so that's interesting. McKinsey did a study back in 2017 where they basically determined that something like 10,000 private Chinese businesses had been established in Africa alone. So there's this silent component of the broader initiative that is the private sector. And for any of you who've been to Africa or many other places around the world, you will know that there are Chinese businesses all over the place. I mean, the hotel that I'm staying at here, for example, the workers that are being used to repair the elevator, they're Chinese. And I've seen Chinese folks all over town. So I don't think there are many countries around the world, frankly, where we can go where we're not going to see a substantial Chinese presence. And actually, this raises an interesting question about just what America needs to do to try and enhance its own presence here. I think we're going to see if there's going to be a change in direction in January. But all I would say for the time being is that we really need to focus on re-engaging with the world because China is focused like a laser.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure, we'll take one last question from our audience before we move on to your other book. But for the audience members, if you do have other questions after this on the Belt and Road Initiative, feel free to put it into the Q&As and we'll get to it at the end. But the last question is, and you touched on it a little bit, you touched on if a government is unable to repay loans, then China can come in or it's, I guess, as part of the contract that they can take advantage of the strategic resources located in that particular country. So the question is, what else do they have to gain in these poor nations in Africa about technology, access to any other materials, or is it just all geopolitical and ports and bases?
Well, it's supposed to be a bit of a two-way street. I mean, certainly an enhancement of bilateral trade is going on in conjunction. All this material has to be imported. And then the Chinese want something back in return, don't they? Usually it's in the form of natural resources or commodities, something like that. So they don't just come in and loan the money and build the stadium and leave. They want something in return. And it is interesting to note also that many of the countries that form the BRI are natural resource rich. If countries don't have something to offer China, it's pretty clear that they get less money or may not even be a participant in the BRI. But if you add another 50 or so countries that have MOUs with the Chinese government, in addition to the 75 or so that are active members, I mean, that's a really big chunk of the world. That's like two-thirds of the countries of the world. So it's very, very well developed, and I think it's going to see an enhancement of Chinese influence around the world well into this decade.
All right, well, I guess I told a lie. I'm gonna ask one last question. What's the name of the hotel you're staying at right now?
It's called the Fleuve Hotel. It's owned by a German company.
Oh,
and it used to be
because one of the comments is, if you are staying in the Fleuve Hotel, it is owned and operated by Chinese.
That's not my understanding. I think it's owned by a German company.
Okay.
But if it's owned by Chinese, that would explain why the Chinese workmen are working on the elevators.
Okay. I found that to be interesting, so I wanted to get to it. But let's shift gears now. I do want to talk about your other book, the America-China Divide, the race to control the world. So my question to you is, who's winning this race and why?
Right. So I'm not sure both countries even know they're necessarily in a race.
Oh,
I don't think the US thinks of it as a race, but I think the Chinese do. And what this is really all about is who is going to control the levers of power, the corridors of power, but also who's going to have the most important and powerful brands? Who is going to be the country that much of the world wants to be associated with, or perhaps wants to have a stronger relationship with? And it's interesting, if you look back at a Pew Center survey from 2018, they surveyed 26,000 people from 25 countries. And one of the questions they asked was, who do you think you would be better off having a closer relationship with? And 63% said America, only 19% said China. And that really says something important, I think, about what the American brand means, still means, to much of the rest of the world. Most of the rest of the world does not want to live in a world that is governed like China is governed. They want to live in a world that is governed like America is governed. And so in terms of who's winning the race, it depends on your perspective and where you are. I think most people still think America is on top in most categories. But if it comes, for example, to influence in poor countries, developing countries, I would say China's got an edge there. It shouldn't come as too much of a surprise for people. And as I alluded to earlier, based on the topic we're talking about, cyber or AI, technology, research, scientific research, whatever it may be, that's a debatable point. I mean, China is really being aggressive in these areas. And so if they are not already on a par with the US, probably they soon will be if they continue to devote the resources that they're devoting to that task.
yeah. Well, getting back to Africa a little bit, obviously you're there now, you're in the DRC, and you've also lived there. So you not only travel extensively to the African continent, but you've lived there for quite a bit. Do you have any personal observations of Chinese influence in Africa, other than what we've already discussed? And so what's their desired end state or their objectives in Africa?
I think the Chinese realize that this is, if you will, the last frontier, the last continent, which has mostly severely underdeveloped countries. But it's also the continent which is going to have the most explosive population growth into 2050. And by that time, it's possible that the population of Africa may actually double. So China's got its eyes on the prize here. They understand what that means. They also see the natural resources here. It's not an accident that some 40 of the 54 countries belong to the BRI. That all said, it's very clear that their influence is very substantial, as I alluded to earlier. And I would simply say that if you haven't seen evidence of Chinese influence in countries elsewhere in the world, you certainly will here. And I think that that's a mixed bag in terms of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think most of the people in the countries here would say they'd rather have that participation and that infrastructure development than not. But it does come at a price, and I think they've realized that now. I also think that African governments are becoming better at saying no to the Chinese government. In fact, Angola has developed a list of things that it would like the Chinese government to develop under the BRI, roads and schools, that sort of thing, rather than Beijing coming with its list and saying, here's what we want you to do. So I think the world in general is open to whether it's going to become more under the Chinese orbit or the American orbit. But we had, as I've said earlier, better get on that horse and start riding.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to kind of expand on that theme a little bit. You just said if our audience, if we are not seeing Chinese influence in other parts of the world, well, maybe we're not looking closely enough, or we're going to see it. But what other, I mean, obviously the Belt and Road Initiative is a great example of Chinese influence in the world. What other areas, do you have any other examples where China is trying to expand their influence worldwide?
I mean, take scientific research. China issued more patents than America did last year. And they're really being aggressive in that area. They're being aggressive, as we know, as we've discussed, and many of your colleagues would know, in the military arena. I'm not a military professional, but having watched the parade in Beijing in October for the 70th anniversary of the birth of the Communist Party, I mean, some of the weaponry they were putting on display there was just incredible. There's hypersonic gliders and stuff like that. Maybe all of you knew about that stuff already. I did not, and I was just sort of blown away with how modern all of that is. So if you consider that that's where they are now, and they're devoting all these resources to the military arena, what's it going to be in 10 or 20 years? And are we going to fall very far behind? On the AI front, China is devoting some $150 billion between now and the end of this decade toward the pursuit of AI, mergers and acquisitions, new technology, doing everything that they can to become supreme in that arena. I have a separate book on that. It's called AI Supremacy, where I talk about some of the things China's doing. So you can almost think of any topic, China is there.
Yeah. I want to ask you a question that I asked a guest a few weeks ago. We had a guest, and when I was talking about what we can do to counter Chinese efforts, the answer was primarily we need to compete. We need to compete in all areas, in science, in military, in politics. So I'm going to ask you the same question and like to hear your response, please. The question is, what is the US and other governments doing to counter the Chinese government's vision of the world? And what really are our prospects of success?
The short answer is not enough, and I would agree with your previous guest. I think the most important thing that we need to do, Kyle, is we need to reestablish firm ground with our most important allies. And once we do that, we need to speak with a common voice. The thing that the Chinese government fears the most is a unified voice from the West. It does not have a lot of allies. The Americans have a tremendous amount of allies. But our problem is that we're not speaking with one voice. Take Huawei, for example. America has been very clear on its concerns about Huawei, and I think those concerns are entirely justified. Anyone familiar with the national security law of China knows that literally any company is required to give the Chinese government its data if it is asked to do so under national security grounds. So if you consider the data that Huawei has access to, and the likelihood that it is simply handing it over to the government because it has to, I mean, I don't understand why any Western government would be doing business with Huawei, particularly in sensitive areas of telecommunications. Now, I think the Germans and the UK, they're slowly coming around to this realization, but there's a perfect example of how we need to circle the wagons, if you will, and speak with that unified voice and put some teeth behind it. You could apply that philosophy on any number of other areas. But if we devote the resources and compete, there's nothing that we can't do. Take 5G, for example. Part of the reason that Huawei's been so attractive to American firms is that we don't have a lot of 5G capability. We could always go to Nokia or Ericsson in Europe, and it would have been a much better choice in my estimation. But what I think this is going to do is it's going to force us to be competitive. If we don't do business with Huawei, then what does that mean? It means we have to develop our own 5 and 6G, and we will do so.
Yeah. So discussing the US influence versus Chinese influence, how would you respond to the comment, and this comes from one of our online members, how would you respond to the comment from a country that says, well, we like Chinese money because they don't tell us what to do?
That's absolutely right. I mean, everybody understands that when America gives aid, it presumes that there's going to be some strings attached. Humanitarian, child labor, environmental issues, all that stuff. It's very important to us, and it should be. China doesn't have any of those concerns, and it says it doesn't put any strings on its money, but that's not exactly true, right?
Right.
I mean, when you're invited into the country to do some projects with Chinese firms, I mean, it's going to be Chinese firms that do the work. They're not going to be outsourcing it to an American or other firm, obviously. So we should take all of that with a grain of salt. They do have strings attached. It is simpler for other countries to simply say, yeah, I'm going to do business with China because they don't care. They look the other way. They may have some similarities in the way their own government operates to many of the poorest, least developed, most corrupt countries around the world. So some think it's a match made in heaven.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about the Chinese military for a few minutes. You, in your book, The America-China Divide, you dedicate an entire chapter to the Chinese military power. And this is a very broad question, but what can you tell us about the Chinese military, their growth, their capability? You said you're not a military expert, so I get that. But what can you tell us about possible future military actions or possible future military reactions?
So my own view is that I think the stakes are so high that it's very unlikely that there's going to be open conflict between the US and China. We look at the South China Sea, for example. You know, China militarized that with us sort of looking the other way, almost winking and nodding, if you will. Maybe that's not fair, but it sure seemed like it to me. They militarized the Spratly and Paracel Islands, and we didn't do much of anything about it. Now they have the ability to project their power there, and we're sort of wondering, well, since they've got these enhanced missiles that can target our aircraft carriers and make them vulnerable, what have we really done to ourselves or allowed them to do to us? Same with Taiwan. I mean, it's been an issue for decades, and nothing's ever happened. But as I understand it, part of the reason nothing's ever happened is that China really didn't have the ability to successfully attack Taiwan. I think many people would agree that's different now, and the stakes are raised even higher as a result. So we're going to have to think of some ways to be smarter about what it is that we do. They practice unrestricted warfare, and for those who may not be familiar with the term, it's based on a book that was written in 1999 by two Chinese colonels, and it basically says that they're going to make up in all sorts of arenas for things that they don't have by being smarter about what it is that they do, and also combining conventional and unconventional approaches to warfare, whether it's economic warfare or military warfare. And that's part of the reason they've developed these missile systems, because they didn't have the aircraft carriers and they didn't have the superior military overall, but they knew they could make the US Navy vulnerable by developing these specialized missiles. So I'll leave it there, but simply to say that we need to take an unconventional approach to this topic. I know many in the military already realize that and are already doing it, but we certainly need to double down on it because they're devoting tremendous resources and they're not looking back.
I actually have heard of that book, Unrestricted Warfare. We used to discuss it in one of the courses I used to teach at JSOU, how they would use, we called it lawfare, how they would use our own laws against us.
Yes.
Yeah, it was very interesting.
If I could just point out on that point, Kyle, let's take the multilateral development banks and the United Nations, for example. Many will not be aware that China is the head of 4 UN agencies. That's more than any other country in the world, including the US. And what they've done is they've used their participation in these multilateral organizations to enhance their influence there. The same is true with multilateral development banks. They're very, very influential in these MDBs. And they may not have the same voting rights. They may not contribute the same amount of capital as the US and other countries do. But believe me, very little gets done without the wink and the nod of China because of its importance.
Yeah. Sir, I want to take another question from our online audience. And the member was recently traveling in Central Asia and noted how the infrastructure there was being developed to his amazement. So he's asking if you have any comment on, and I don't want to limit you to just Central Asia, but do you have any comment on that particular area or any other areas with infrastructure development?
Well, Central Asia was the birthplace, if you will, of the BRI. As I mentioned earlier, it was launched in Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. there's lots of Chinese projects all over the place. It was also, if you will, the first location in the world, Central Asia more generally, where the backlash against the BRI started. I think it's partially because historically the Central Asian nations have had a pretty close relationship with China in many cases. And I think they're also more sensitive to Chinese influence. So when it comes, for instance, to competing with Chinese firms, you know, many of these people in these countries did not wait too long before raising their voices. It took Africa much longer to start raising its voice in objection, and of course it's come around on that front. But I think Central Asia holds a special place for the Chinese as well, and they're very active. They're going to remain very active there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, when I was doing research for this particular interview, it seemed like everywhere I went, I was always reading something about China. Whether it's the militarization of island chains or their growth in other nations. I even saw an article on their underwater special operations forces recently that they're developing. But a little bit larger picture, you mentioned Taiwan earlier. So I have a question from an online member, and it's basically asking you, what are the implications of the US cabinet official visiting Taiwan recently?
Yeah, I read about that while I've been on my trip. From the Chinese perspective, of course, they're going to look at that as inflammatory and unnecessary, probably they would say. But it's very important to America that the Taiwanese understand that our agreements with them remain in place and that we intend to honor them if there's ever a problem. So I think it's one of those unique cases where we have the ability to up the ante simply by having a cabinet official go visit there. It's not that anything fundamental has changed between Taiwan and China. It hasn't.
Right.
And I still maintain the belief that here we are 50, 60 years later since Taiwan became independent and there's been no such invasion. I don't believe there's going to be an invasion there. I think the stakes are simply too high, and it also would prevent China from saying that it's a peaceful power and it's practicing a peaceful rise. But in truth, you know, in recent history, China has not had much of a history of being an aggressor power. It's aggressor economically and politically, but not militarily, many would say. So I think it's going to remain a sore point between the two countries for decades to come.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I have one final question about your America-China Divide book. And it's actually a question about your dedication of the book. And I'm going to read it for our members of the audience. It says, "This book is dedicated to everyone on planet Earth. May America and China possess the wisdom to work together to make it a better place." That's a pretty big dedication right there to everyone on the planet. But I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball here. Are you an optimist that our two countries will indeed work together towards the betterment of the world, or are you a pessimist?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the reason I said that, first of all, is that it seemed very clear to me in writing the book that there really are only two choices. And I think most of the world realizes there are only two choices. And I discussed earlier who I think they would want to actually succeed in the end. I remain somewhat optimistic about our ability to patch up the bilateral relationship, even at this very difficult time. And both sides, of course, have contributed to why it's so difficult. It hasn't been one side or the other. It's been both willing to do it. I think both countries are practicing what I call co-opetition, which means we cooperate in those few places where we can, but mostly we compete. And I think the leaderships on both sides of the Pacific realize, again, that the stakes are so high, but also that we need each other. And the people of the countries realize that we need each other. So we have the trade conflict, and the consumers on both sides of the Pacific and in much of the rest of the world have already either made their choice or made alternative choices about where they're going to purchase their goods from going forward. So I think that ship has sailed, and I think that the damage, if you will, that has been done by the trade conflict has already been done, and those decisions and the impact on the supply chains have already been made. I think the people of the world still have a lot of pain to endure as long as this competition is heating up as fiercely as it is. And I think the world's landscape is going to continue to change. But at the end of the day, 10, 20 years from now, I still think it's the case that there will only basically be two choices. And my hope and expectation is that America is going to be stronger 1 or 2 decades from now than it is even now. China probably believes the same thing. So our ability to really counter those initiatives and also come up with our own strategies that might provide a viable alternative to many of the world's people, make it clear what those choices are. I think it's imperative, and we will.
Right. Well, sir, I want to ask you a question that I asked you the first time that you joined us. So hopefully you'll remember that answer. But in the introduction, I mentioned how our national defense strategy has shifted away from counterterrorism efforts to what we call great power competition, GPC, with a focus on China and Russia. And I think most people's opinions are China is probably the larger threat, economically and militarily. So I'm going to ask you the same question because I think it bears repeating. What is your opinion of this strategy change and moving away from what we've been doing for so many decades now into GPC? Are we moving more into another Cold War with the two countries?
Yeah, I think we're already there, basically. It's not manifesting itself on the military battlefield, of course, but in virtually every other way. I mean, let's take, for example, the Philippines. I mean, the Philippines has been one of America's staunchest allies for decades, generations. And it's really interesting. You've got that strongman Duterte there. He got in 2016. And you wouldn't have thought that the Philippines would be a country that would ever shift away from its allegiance and alliance with America. And it has. It didn't take China long to basically, in essence, dismantle that relationship, culminating in the threat this year by Duterte to basically terminate the visiting forces agreement, which he didn't end up doing. But if you had said to somebody 5 years ago that this special relationship that we've had with the Philippines would be dismantled in such a short period of time, no one would have believed you. And even where the Spratly Islands are concerned and the South China Sea, I mean, Philippines went to the Hague and actually won in the Hague and basically showed that there was no standing under international law for what China had been doing. Anyway, all that to say, I think great power competition is manifesting itself in many ways that a lot of us haven't even contemplated before. And if you put the picture together in all the ways that China is sort of firing on all pistons, economically, politically, militarily, technologically, et cetera, that's the great power competition now. It's not simply limited to politics or even economics or the military on its own. It's multifaceted, and that's the basis upon which we're going to have to view this going forward.
Yeah. Well, I want to take this moment because we are talking about great power competition for the members of our audience, just to let them know that JSOU is going to begin a quarterly seminar on great power competition because this is a new shift in our strategy. Obviously, USSOCOM has to figure out where we're going to fall in this strategy, and we're going to have, like I said, quarterly seminars on the topic. And Mr. Wagner, I hope that you'd be interested in attending one and possibly speaking at some in the future, because I do think these are topics that definitely need to be discussed, and we have to understand it. So, sir, I think what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to offer you an opportunity to really provide some closing comments to our audience. We have got a lot of USSOCOM members online here, as well as academics from other institutions. So no topic, do you have any closing comments for our audience?
I would simply suggest that when you're traveling around the world, if you haven't been orientated to thinking about Chinese influence in these countries, take a look around. Some of those influences are going to sort of hit you smack in the face. It's going to be so obvious. Others are going to be far more subtle. And whether it's the Chinese influence in the arts, whether it's in transportation networks, whether it's in advertising, whatever it may be in these countries, I think you're going to find that there are going to be very few places where the Chinese influence is not very significant indeed. So perhaps that can help you reflect on your own orientation to this very important topic in this great power relationship, in this bilateral relationship. Maybe help you think about what you might be able to do to make a contribution in that regard. But I know that our leadership is certainly focused on this, and I don't think, for example, that if the Democrats were to take control of the White House and possibly the Congress in January, I don't think that's necessarily going to result in any wholesale change vis-a-vis China. I think there's wide bipartisan agreement on what China is and is not at this point. And I would credit Mr. Trump for having brought that to the fore and helping everybody see exactly what this is and having the courage to actually tackle it head on, which is exactly what I think needed to be done. So I think we're all on the same page on that.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Daniel, your books, in my opinion, I think they do a really good job of showing how the Chinese government, their businesses, their people have become really an overwhelming force to be reckoned with throughout the developing world. The Belt and Road Initiative, as we first discussed, using your words, it's really not just a massive global construction project. There are other agendas involved. It's a scheme to protect Chinese power and influence, enhance diplomatic relationships, and ensure that scores of countries around the world become dependent upon Beijing. So, sir, I really do want to thank you for taking your time out of your business trip in the Democratic Republic of Congo for joining us for this hour tonight.
I was really happy to be able to do so. It was a great conversation, and I thank you again, Kyle.
Absolutely. For our online audience, if you have any feedback on this session, or if you'd like to nominate other speakers for our Think JSOU program, please contact us at thinkjsou@socom.mil. And I always like to close by encouraging everyone to explore the complete Think JSOU collection by subscribing through the library, APAN, or on JSOU's social media sites. You'll be able to find the first interview with Mr. Wagner on our JSOU YouTube channel, as well as on our library, as well as on APAN. As mentioned in the library, of course, that's an exceptional resource for all these videos, as well as JSOU monographs through the JSOU Press. So this series is brought to you by the Department of Strategic Studies and the Joint Special Operations University. And I want to thank everyone for attending today's session.